All right, let's get rolling. Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope that you had a good long Veterans Day weekend. So we're getting back into some new content for week 8. This is actually our third to last week in the class. We'll be going over elements of relationships and communication this week. And then the next week we have entirely off due to the Thanksgiving break. You probably received some announcements and notes about how some of the buildings and facilities are going to remain open during the first 2 or 3 days of next week. We will not have any class meetings for the week of Thanksgiving break. So that's coming up. And then after that, we will have 2 more weeks of class meetings. So we're really getting pretty close to the finish line here. And I wanted to give you a few updates about what to know as we head into some of our final meetings of the term. To get us started, this is going to have us think back a little bit. On Wednesday, we spent some time going over a few different theories in mediated communication. So of these theories, which presents the concept of hyperpersonal communication? Either A, uses and gratifications, B, social presence, C, media richness, or D, social information processing theory. I'll give you a couple minutes to think about this, and then we'll talk about this question together. Okay, let's talk about this question together. So got some different theories about mediated or communication, and one of them describes hyperpersonal communication. How many people believe this is A, uses and gratifications, B, social presence, C, media richness, or D, social information processing theory? How many people are unsure? So it looks like a lot of you. Okay. The best answer to this question is social information processing theory. So as you're gearing up for the final exam and catching up on the readings in the next few weeks, I really recommend that you look back through these 4 different theories about mediated communication that are discussed in the book and kind of get a grasp of some of those. So uses and gratifications theory is the idea that media's power is limited, but that we have power in choosing media that fulfill our needs. A really good example of this is if you use a streaming service like Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus, right? You go on the service and you get to choose what you want to watch. And media has to update the content that it has based on your needs. That's why you see a lot of the streaming wars and people moving between platforms. Netflix is losing subscribers because maybe their content doesn't fulfill our needs. Social presence theory deals with the idea that our presence can be measured on a spectrum, right? How socially present somebody is in an interaction impacts how much meaning is conveyed. If you're muted and your video is off in a Zoom meeting and you're not present at the meeting versus being very active and participatory in a video call, right? That's different measures of presence. Media richness theory deals with the idea that media runs a spectrum in terms of how engaged it is. On the one end, you have something very disengaged or cold, such as an asynchronous email, to something very engaged, like a live video call or game, or watching a video on TikTok. And then social information processing theory comes from Joseph Walther, and he brings forward the idea of hyper-personal communication, which is the idea that our communication can be more intimate or more intense or closer than our face-to-face interactions. How many people have heard of or watched the film Her? This is a movie that came out several years ago starring Joaquin Phoenix. And the premise of the movie is that he has an AI that's entirely audio that he listens to and he talks to, right? And over the course of talking to her and forming more of a relationship and disclosing as an AI, she learns, she grows, and he begins to develop kind of a romantic attachment to his AI, right? And this idea is the idea of hyperpersonal communication, that he's able to form a relationship that's closer, it's more engaged or more active than it might otherwise be just through communicating via media, because we can communicate in a lot of other contexts and settings outside of regular face-to-face contact. Right? So these four theories are really good to know. Social information processing and hyperpersonal, I think, are good things to know going into the exam. So definitely recommend refreshing on some of those as you're gearing up for that. So last class, we talked about media's role in shaping our identity development and our understanding of communication, particularly in guiding theories about media and communication, including the ones that we talked about. We also talked about the idea of Erik Erikson's identity development stages, and the idea that we move between contradictions in our life. What is my sense of identity? Have I lived a fulfilling life? We use media as a way of helping us to engage with those questions, especially if we're a teenager and we're trying to figure out who we are by engaging in online communities, or we're an adult and we're trying to figure out how to form meaningful relationships. So this week, we are getting into relationships and the idea of relational development. So we'll be looking at relationships and the ways that relationships are communicated. And I also will give us a chance to look at this in the context of the recording and reflection essay that's coming up. So the recording and reflection essay is due in a week. It's due this Sunday by 11:59 p.m. How many folks have completed their recorded conversation? Okay, so a few of you. If you haven't, I highly recommend doing that as soon as you can, because there'll be time that it takes for you to have the conversation, transcribe the conversation, and then use that transcription for your analysis. So I really recommend taking some time to get on that assignment, since it will take a while to do the transcription and to start to analyze that. Because we have the essay due on Sunday, there's no Canvas prompt this week. So this week is not one of the 8. So it's a chance for you to catch up and to work on that. Again, I do give you the option, if you need an extension, to contact me in advance. So by the end of the day today, if you feel like you need an extension due to travel, other things going on in classes and so on, just let me know. I've mentioned this on the description on Canvas, but for the recording and reflection essay, you do want to include 3 things. You can either pack them all together in a single document, or if you submit multiple times, I get to see each of the submissions that you've made, so you can do that as well. What you need to include in this submission is the transcript, right? So you do not need to include an MP3 file or a video. You do not need to include the audio or video of the conversation. What you do need to include is transcribing that audio to text and essentially having that text between you and that other person. I've included an example of what a transcription might look like. You can use things such as initials between people. You can also use brackets to indicate nonverbal communication and stage directions. Make sure that you're including that, but the transcription does not count toward the essay page, right? So if you have, say, 3 pages of your transcription, that would not count toward 3 pages in the essay itself. The analysis, right, is the way that you incorporate ideas and concepts from the course in order to understand and make sense of the conversation. So for example, right, you might be talking about how social penetration theory and the ways that we move to different layers and levels of disclosure happens through this conversation. Or maybe you're thinking about media and the idea of media presence theory, in which we're very present and involved in that interaction using media. A good way to go is to use 2 or 3 major concepts or ideas and developing different paragraphs that are expanding on and explaining some of those. Again, I've included an example outline on Canvas that might show how you structure that essay. You will want to make sure to include the in-text citations, right? Whenever you're citing from the textbook, please make sure to include that in MLA, APA, or a Chicago footnote or endnote. And then do remember that you need a works cited page for this one. So a couple weeks ago, I showed you that if you enter the name of the textbook in the citation maker, right, it will produce a citation in that format, has that pre-ready. Another thing you can do is the front page of Canvas. I have included all of the front matter of the textbook, including the author, the year, and so on. And that gives you all the information that you need in order to develop a full citation in MLA, APA, or Chicago, right? I would much rather have you turn in the assignment late, right, and lose 5% for each day it's late than to not turn it in with citations, right? Please do not procrastinate on citations, because if you do not cite sources on this assignment, right, that would be a 0 on the assignment. It would be plagiarism. So please make sure that you're including those and letting me know if you're running into issues with citations and including those. If you've been taking notes on the readings, but you haven't indicated a page number, what I recommend that you do is to just do a Control F or search through that week's content and find the page number or section that specifically talks about what it is that you're referencing, especially because there's pretty clear headings and subheadings on some of the different sections there. So that's what I'm looking for with this on Sunday. Again, I'm happy to look over rough drafts or outlines. Send them to me by the latest on Friday. They're optional, you don't have to, but I'm happy to turn them around and let you know what's going well and what you can continue to work on. And again, I recommend using that rubric that's available on Canvas that lists how I'll be grading and going through the assignment. You might look through the rubric first and use that to inform how you're writing. Any questions on this? And if you're running into questions, especially as you get close to the due date, please let me know and I'm happy to help. Yes.
So for the transcription and the actual essay, that's all on one doc, like not turn it in separate.
You can do either, right? So you can include it in a single document if that's easier for you, but if you resubmit it to Canvas, then I get to see all the older versions too. Good question. Yeah.
So do you require patient numbers for APA and text citations? If it's not a quote?
Sure. If you are not including a quote, it's not necessary. I would just do the last name and year or the last, so I just do that, or just the last name and MLA. So one thing that I wanted to let you know that will hopefully be helpful for you as you're preparing and thinking about this is that today and Wednesday's class, we'll be looking at relationships and this kind of new unit in interpersonal communication. But Friday is kind of similar to the Monday we had before the midterm exam, where attendance is optional. I won't be formally taking attendance. But if you come to class this Friday, that's an opportunity for you if you'd like a space to workshop and develop your essay. I'll be available to answer questions, or if you just want accountability buddies in working through that project, right? The class will be open for you to do that. I know a lot of people are traveling and not here toward the end of the week because of Thanksgiving break anyway. So you're welcome to come to class. I'll be here and available to help you out, but it's not required. It's just meant to give you some more space as you're working through this essay. And while we're meeting this week, remember that next week for Thanksgiving break, we don't have any class meetings. And then when we come back, we have 2 weeks left before the end of the term. And we do not have an in-class meeting for the final exam day. Instead, that'll be just like the midterm where you have a 72-hour window to take it on Canvas. Again, I know a lot of people are traveling and probably already hit the road by the final exam period. That's something that you're able to do remotely. All right, any other questions? No, it's a number of housekeeping things, but I think it's good to just be clear and remind you about some of the things coming up. Okay, so let's get talking about relationships, right? And in the context of this class, the relationships that we form with other people are incredibly important and matter in terms of how and why we communicate. In fact, over the past 2.5 years, in the context of COVID-19, many people have noticed shifts in the importance of relationships in their lives, the role of media in their relationships, and the challenge of maintaining relationships. I was talking to a close family member, and they were saying that yes, they're a more introverted person, but the social isolation that they experienced under COVID helped them to realize that they're not that introverted and have made them more interested in seeking social relationships now that they have more opportunity to do so. And that's a trend that we've more generally noticed, is the shifts in our understanding of our relationship needs once those needs are no longer available for us. So relationships matter, especially in the context of this class, right? Because if we think back to the role of fulfilling human needs, we think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Relationships are designed to fulfill needs that we have in our lives. We'll be talking about exchange theory in just a minute, but the idea is that if we're looking at our safety needs and our love and belonging needs in particular, our social relationships with other people are a mechanism by which we can get those things met. And interpersonal communication is a big way that that happens. Think back to the theories we've talked about so far in the class, things like uncertainty reduction, social penetration theory, and so on. These are predicated on the idea that our ability to talk to other people, to disclose and share more, is a way that our relationships develop. Yes, we do activities, but even within those activities, we communicate, right? We use nonverbal communication, playing basketball with a friend, and we say, nice shot, if they are able to do a really good free throw, right? But I think the other thing that's important for us to think about is that communication is the way that we're able to define and even cognitively understand what our relationships are. In other words, we use communication to define and categorize the relationships that we have in our lives. For instance, a common refrain in a lot of dating contexts is if two people are getting together and starting to get to know each other, one person might ask, well, what are we, right? And trying to establish a label or commonly held understanding of the status of their relationship. Speaking to the ways that communication is used to define and understand how we relate to other people, right? So we use communication to build and develop relationships. We also use communication to understand what those relationships even are. So there's a variety of things that help us to define and to think about the relationships that we have in our lives, right? One of the biggest ones here is an idea of duration. A lot of our relationships with family members in particular are as close or as significant as they are because that person has likely been around from a very young age. For many of us, that person has been in our lives for as long as we can remember. And oftentimes a relationship with longer duration means that there has been more opportunity for you and that person to self-disclose, to get to know each other, to share details about each other, and so on, right? That even if you're not as actively communicating with an old friend, there's so much history and context there that you're easily able to snap back and talk to them when you're able to see them. So how long you're with somebody else is a really important part. It creates more opportunities for self-disclosure and sharing, but it also means that persistent relationships tend to be our most important. Another idea here is contact frequency, right? And it's how often you are communicating and engaging with that person. So studies have shown that over time, we are more attracted to, we consider people more attractive with whom we interact regularly. That's part of why oftentimes coworkers might start to date or marry each other, right? Is because they have more exposure and involvement with each other in a professional basis, right? We see this represented a lot of times in media too. You watch The Office, right? The relationship between Jim and Pam, characterized by two coworkers who work in the same building and regularly interact with each other. contact frequency is very high, so we really start to understand and connect with one another. So how often you communicate with somebody is a really big factor that shapes our relationship too. We might think back to social penetration theory and the idea of disclosure and sharing, right? How much do you choose to share with that other person? And to what degree do you experience distance based on things that you're not able or comfortable to share? For example, if you find yourself with a relative or family member with whom you disagree on issues that might be social or political, right? You might be strategic in what you choose to share and talk about with that person. Right? So, for instance, I love live music. I love seeing bands perform, but I know that maybe some of the lyrics and some of those songs would not be things that my mom would like. So, being strategic in how I share that information is a factor that a lot of us have to consider. Support is this question of how you count on or rely on the other person to fulfill needs that are important to you, right? An easy way to think about this is, who is your emergency contact? There's a good chance that that's somebody with whom you have a high level of support. And again, a lot of times, close family members, friends, or romantic relationships are ones where we experience that high level of support. Or sometimes we find ourselves in relationships that require support, even if they're not relationships that we actively choose. For example, we might not like our boss, but at the end of the day, we want to have our paycheck. There's interaction variability as well, and this is the trickier one, right? So here's one way of thinking about it. Say you have a friend that you know pretty well, and you're able to do all sorts of things with that friend. Maybe you watch sports together, you like to go biking together, and sometimes you just like to vent about your week and talk about what it's like being a student. Okay? So that would be a high level of interaction variability. With that person, you're able to communicate in a lot of different ways. You're able to do a lot of different things. Now, say you had another friend, and maybe the only thing you and that friend really have in common is you both like to watch the same sports team. But outside of that, you don't really have much to talk about. It's hard to find things in common. That would be a lower interaction variability, right? To what degree can you communicate differently with that person depending on the context or the situation? That's the idea of interaction variability. And then lastly is this question about goals, right? So sometimes people in relationships are not necessarily aligned in terms of goals. Our relationships can be platonic, it can be friendships, families, romantic relationships, and so on. But there's a good chance that there are ways that you would like to see a relationship play out. For example, maybe you have a good friend and maybe you're not a big texter. You don't really like texting somebody super often, but you do like there to be some level of contact, right? But that other friend texts you nonstop. They message you all the time and it's a little bit excessive. In this way, your goals are different in terms of your contact frequency. So you might choose to say, hey, I'm sorry, I don't really text a whole lot. I'm hearing your messages, but I'm not super fast at text. I'm not the best at text, right? You can choose to explain and maybe alter the goals of that relationship, or you can choose not to disclose and have some differences in what you're looking for there. You might be familiar with a movie that came out about a decade ago called Friends with Benefits with Justin Timberlake and Mila Kunis, right? And the premise of that film, right, and the premise of that phrase was that the two were sexually involved, but they weren't interested in pursuing each other romantically. They just wanted to be friends who were involved in that way, right? But over the course of the film, as you can probably imagine, their goals shift. One person develops feelings for the other one, right? And the goals that they have of their relationship are not necessarily aligned in that same way. So oftentimes we find ourselves using communication to speak about, manage, and resolve differences that we might have in our relationship goals. It's an important thing to consider in how these relationships play out. We also have what are considered to be 3 forms of attraction. And again, the attraction we feel is not necessarily based on sexual or romantic attraction, though it can be in those contexts too. Physical attraction, of course, plays a major role in connections with other people. In fact, studies have suggested that what is considered to be a more physically attractive person is a person that is more likely to get a job or have a higher quality of life in their interactions with other people. But it's important for us to keep in mind that the definition of what physical attractiveness is varies a lot depending on culture and context. We can trace this over time, but we can also trace how things such as body shape, type, and physical characteristics might be seen as more positive, negative, and so on, depending on the culture and their set of beliefs, right? Again, in a number of cultures, a larger body size, larger BMI might be associated with physical attractiveness. So those things are not necessarily set in stone across all cultures. Social attraction deals with the idea of seeing somebody as fun and willing to be around. That is, we find ourselves drawn to people that we see as fun or interesting. Right? A lot of advertising will use images and depictions of people that seem fun and socially engaging to represent types of people who buy their products, right? You should buy this because you can be like this fun person. In fact, some advertisers, I think like Liberty Mutual, is even tongue-in-cheek about it, where they say in an ad, studies show that you're more likely to buy it if it looks like there's a young couple having fun in the ad. And they like blatantly show that to make an argument that's memorable. Right? So social attraction is a big thing that we look to. And then task attraction, right? Oftentimes we are drawn to people, especially in the context of our needs, who fit specific knowledge or expertise as it relates to goals that we're interested in. So for instance, maybe you have a friend who's really good with computers and technology, and your laptop is acting up, you're not able to get your assignments or get your meetings or anything, and you invite that friend over to help you out. You're more attracted or drawn to that person on the basis of their ability to support you on issues that you might be concerned about. So we do feel attraction and connection to people in a variety of these different ways that could be romantic or sexual, but don't necessarily have to be in platonic friendships. So we find ourselves drawn to other people for a lot of different reasons, right? Again, one of them being the idea of proximity. How physically close are we to somebody else? Again, we're more attracted to people that we have regular contact with and we see day in, day out. We can think back to uncertainty reduction theory to help us understand why. Over time, we find ourselves better able to predict and understand what other people will say or do, and we feel more comfortable knowing how they'll behave. Physicality deals with this idea of having an active and meaningful exchange with that person. So yes, you could be able to get in touch with an old friend, but how long does it take you to drive and go see them? How often do you get to see them face to face, right? Our active presence, and this might connect to media richness, is an idea that's important for us to think about too. We'll get to perceived gain in a minute with social exchange theory, but it's this idea that yes, in most of our relationships, whether we are thinking about it or not, we see something that we find valuable or important or additive to our lives from that relationship. We like having another person around, and we feel like that person is adding to our lives in some capacity. We find ourselves drawn to both similarities and differences with other people for different reasons, right? We might like people that are similar to us because we find that they can share the experiences that we do, but we might also like the novelty of somebody that comes from a totally different life experience or perspective than what we do, right? Oftentimes, you might remember in grade school, if there was a new kid who came to class, or maybe you were the new kid, right? And you transferred to a new school, oftentimes people are incredibly interested. Who is this person? What's going on with them, right? And make an effort to get to know them. And then disclosure, right? We tend to be more attracted to people with whom we disclose and share more about ourselves. In part because we see comfort that causes us to disclose, or we see people with whom we're willing to share and confide secrets with. So there's a lot in pop culture over the past several decades and discussion. There's a truism that we oftentimes hear that opposites attract. That two people who have some major differences in their lifestyle and their values and their beliefs and so on are going to be drawn to each other. And that's a trope we see happen a lot. But studies tell us a different story, that actually opposites do not generally attract. Although, yes, it's possible for people from very different experiences to have meaningful relationships with each other, of course. But more likely, we tend to be drawn to people who are similar to us in aspects of social and cultural difference. And there's a variety of different reasons why this is the case, right? For instance, it's easier for us to initiate and maintain a relationship if we know that we have things in common with another person, right? If you and another person love watching football, right, that's an easy way for you and that person to bond, to have a topic of conversation, to do activities with each other, and so on, right? It's easier to develop relationships and find things to do on that basis, right? But it can also be easier to understand and feel like you're able to speak to similar sets of issues. For example, both my partner and I love to put on headphones to disengage in work. We don't really talk to each other during that time because we're really tunnel vision work mode. And we understand that, but not everybody does, right? So we feel support on that basis of mutually understanding our needs. Opposites can create initial excitement when we're drawn to people who might be very different than us. But over time, it can be challenging to maintain relationships if there's not a serious effort to really understand, to empathize where that other person is coming from, right? If you are a very organized and neat person and somebody else is very spontaneous, over time, you might find yourself frustrated if they randomly are hosting parties without telling you, right? So frustration and friction can develop in relationship maintenance from people who come from very different experiences. So this brings us to exchange theory, right? And exchange theory, I think, is useful, but I think can also have its critique, right? If you've ever watched the show The Good Place, right? The premise of the show is that the afterlife, at least in the beginning, is determined because you accumulate points based on the good decisions you make in your life. And if you reach a certain number of points, right, you make it to the good place, right? And that's kind of a way of thinking about social exchange theory, and I think points to the weirdness of quantifying our relationships, right? Social exchange theory suggests that there's a formula. The value of our relationship is based on the positives or the benefits of the relationship minus the perceived negatives or costs of that relationship. And it says, you take positives, you take the negatives, you add it up, and if the total is positive, then we continue that relationship. But if the total is negative, then we likely are moving toward ending the relationship, right? Common phrase used a lot in like Gen Z context is using the phrase toxic to describe somebody, right? Somebody or their behavior is toxic and they do not want that person in their life, or maybe they're blocking that person. Oftentimes, right, a person is blocked or cut out or ghosted or socially excluded because the other person does not see that relationship as a beneficial element of their lives. Maybe that person is really hurtful or negative. Maybe it's just not what that person wants. There's a common phrase, right, that a positive relationship is at the top, but no relationship is better than a negative relationship. And so this suggests that we will continue and pursue relationships if we see them as overall being worth it. We might ghost somebody or disengage if it's just too much work or we don't really enjoy spending time with that person. Right? And so it's the comparison level of the relationship versus nothing, or the relationship versus an alternative. Right? So maybe you are not a big fan of your friend group, and maybe you're interested in forming new connections. You might message and spend more time with members of a different group. And again, I think this can be a little bit callous and weird, right? We're not saying, well, overall, you have 2,000 positive points, but you got 1,500 negative points. But I guess you total up to 500. So you know what? I guess I am going to go get lunch with you today, right? We don't say or do those things. And oftentimes we continue relationships that using this measurement might have more negatives. And we oftentimes do so out of obligation, out of a feeling that we do care for that person. Or, right, in the case, for instance, of survivors of abuse, right, there are other strategic decisions and reasons that somebody might need to remain in a relationship, at least for a period of time, even if it seems like that relationship is doing more harm than good. Right? So this is not to say the be-all, end-all that we only maintain and continue relationships with the good outweighs the bad, just to say that we're oftentimes at some level making it a calculation about whether or not we see our relationships as fulfilling our needs and judging relationships to some extent on that basis. As we've talked about a little bit, right, birds of a feather is the idea that we're oftentimes drawn to people who share similarities with us, not necessarily in every single way, right? We open up for difference and disagreement, but there are elements that we see as similar with each other that we do appreciate. One of them being the idea of validation. So for instance, if you grew up in a particular small town in Eastern Oregon, right, somebody can affirm your perspective if they grew up in a similar town and can speak to kind of your rural experience growing up in a way that somebody from the city couldn't. Predictability deals with the idea that you feel safe around that person. Again, with uncertainty reduction theory, the more time we spend with that person, the more we come to predict and expect the ways that they'll behave. And then affiliation is a sense of shared identity. Do we feel connection with that person? If you're both a fan of a sports team, right? You might wear the same jersey, you might watch the same games, you might have a lot of investment to that same degree. So the similarity thesis is arguing that we oftentimes are choosing relationships that share some level of similarity to us. The last thing that I want to talk about before I show a video example and ask you to do an attendance activity for today is Knapp and Van Glisti's model of relationships. And what this essentially says is that our relationships have 10 different stages. Stages of coming together and stages of falling apart. So not every single relationship goes through all 10 of these stages. And these stages are not necessarily linear. In fact, a lot of our relationships never really make it past these first 3 stages or so, right? Some relationships, right, if you've ever watched the videos of the really cute old couples who've been together for like 50 years, have stayed up here at this bonding stage and haven't gone down this way. Still, other relationships could begin to develop, begin to erode, and then start to come back a little bit if people are able to rekindle or reconnect over time. So this is not a one-way linear model, right? This doesn't say we go through all 10. Doesn't say we only move in one direction, but does suggest that our relationships can both build and decay across these 10 different steps. So let's talk a little bit more about that, right? So the first 5 steps are related to coming together. For instance, right, there's been a lot of discussion about like romances. For instance, in the Marvel universe, right, the Chris's, like Chris Evans, Chris Hemsworth, and so on, Chris Pratt, and so on, right, tend to be really close with each other. And there's been an emphasis on platonic relationships among men. And we can see a lot of these things at play. The initiating, dealing with the very brief and initial contact. If you ever are like me and you're watching like a silly Hallmark movie, right, or a silly rom-com, oftentimes these movies start with like some type of meet cute. So for instance, 2 people like run into each other while they're holding groceries and somebody helps the other person up and then looks into their eyes, right? So it's very silly, but we have an initial contact with that person. And oftentimes that initial contact doesn't necessarily mean that we're really drawn to that person. It might just be a casual getting to know who that person is. Then we experiment. We figure out the other person and figure out if you want to move forward. In a romantic context, that might be starting to figure out what are your deal breakers or boundaries. You might be very direct and say, do you want kids? Do you want to get married? Do you want a house? Or it could be more organic, where you start to get to know and understand where that person is coming from. Intensifying is sharing more intimate and personal details with somebody. So again, moving into more of the central layers of social penetration theory, sharing personal details and important elements of your lives. You integrate or become a couple at the 4th stage. That might be, for instance, being official on social media, right? So when I was growing up, Facebook was really popular, and the idea of being Facebook official with somebody else, so-and-so and so-and-so, or in a relationship, was seen as a really big deal, right? People were like, OMG, they're dating. Oh, wow, right? That might be a stage in which there's that integration. And then oftentimes the bonding stage is a more public reveal or display of a relationship, oftentimes through some type of ceremony, such as a wedding, right? So the bonding stage is kind of at this really close exchange. On the downward side, right, and again, not all relationships have this, you have the idea of differentiating, starting to define yourself as a person outside of the couple more, and choosing to spend time a bit more doing your own thing. Maybe it's saying, you know what, I'm just going to go on this myself. And it can be healthy, right, to spend time on your own, but doing that in a way that's taking time away from the relationship or identifying yourself more outside of a relationship is generally seen as this first stage of coming apart. Circumscribing is limiting your time with the other person. It might be to say, I don't know. We talked about having dinner, but I really want to go and do something else, right? You're limiting your time with that person and not necessarily valuing that relationship in the same. There can be a feeling of stagnation, right? Feeling like the relationship isn't progressing, maybe you're doing the same old routine and you're not really growing or trying new things in the relationship. Toward the end, you might avoid and keep away from the relationship. You might do longer trips, you might ghost and spend less time with that person because you really kind of see the writing on the wall and you're interested in kind of moving that relationship toward ending. And at the very end, you could choose to terminate or just completely end the relationship. So these 10 different stages, 5 of coming together, 5 of coming apart, don't describe every relationship, but they do help us to understand how relationships can change over the course of our lives. One really good example of this is a movie that came out a little over a decade ago called 500 Days of Summer with Zooey Deschanel and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Is there anybody who's seen this movie before? Heard of this one? So the premise of this film, right, is that it's a relationship between these two characters. And the film is kind of non-linear, right? It follows the relationship between the two, but it's jumping between the 500 days that they were in a relationship, from the early stages to the later stages of coming apart and everywhere in between. And the main character is trying to understand what went wrong or how the relationship fell apart, right? Why did this happen? And what we can see kind of through this clip, this trailer of the film, is the ways in which the different stages of coming together and falling apart play out and how they shape the understanding of the relationship more broadly.
I love this one. Sorry? I said I love this one. You like I love them.
Oh my gosh, I love this. We have so much in common, right? Initiating.
A boy eats girl.
They made that
The boy, Tom Henson, grew up believing that he'd never truly be happy until the day he met the one. The girl, some Ben, did not share this belief. And she knew up front, this is not a love story.
I think you should stop seeing. Sit down.
Insulated rigs. Oh yeah, I'm warm.
Maybe she was not hurt. Maybe she was not any better than everyone. Super skin.
You know, girl. I was very sweet and working.
She have a boyfriend?
No, don't need it. We're young, might as well have fun while we can.
Wait. What happened was love.
You don't believe that, do you?
What? Love, it's not Santa Claus. It's official. I'm in love with someone. I love how she makes me feel.
Did you hear that for you? What happened? Why didn't they work out?
Get over it. I don't want to get over it. I want to get it back.
Right, so relationships develop, they intensify, but as she kind of says toward the end, well, what happened to our relationship? Why aren't we as close? Well, life, right? And again, this kind of nonlinear structure moving between the different stages of the relationship is an example of these 10 different relationship stages in action. So what I'd like you to do, and we'll get to some of the relationship maintenance stuff next class, is to think of an example of a relationship with somebody else that's important to you. Using the 10 different stages of relationships, where does this fit? And why do you feel like it fits in one of these 10? And what are some of the major things that you and that person gain from the relationship? So take some time to write or type this. Think about this response. Okay, so you're finishing up. We've spent some time today talking about and helping you prepare for that recording and reflection essay, talking a little bit about relationships and communication and some of the different stages that relationships have, both in getting together and coming apart. We'll look more about this at Wednesday's class, including relationship maintenance strategies and how we engage with relationships with other people. So when you have finished this attendance activity, please pass forward or email it to me. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I'll see you again for Wednesday's class.
But we,